Ah, all right. Greetings, everyone. I am recording a lecture now on an argument analysis. This is meant to supplement my previous notes on formal logic and informal logic, and it's more of a direct application of language analysis, argument analysis, but there's more to analyzing an argument than merely looking at the logic of the argument. You also want to look at the content and evaluate the content of the argument. So we'll be talking about that in this presentation. And in order to do that, let me share my screen. And again, continuing on our theme of logic and critical thinking. Whoops. Okay. There we are. So philosophical logic is concerned with evaluating both types of arguments that we discussed, deductive arguments and inductive arguments. Essentially, there are only two questions to ask when confronted with an argument. In the end, a critical examination of an argument only requires that one ask and answer these two questions. So later in this course, you're going to be doing an assessment of an argument as a paper assignment, and I'm going to be asking you to do precisely that, to ask and answer these two questions. We'll have more to say about the paper later on in the semester, but essentially you're going to do a critical summary where you analyze the argument that's being given. What is the conclusion that the author is offering? What reasons has the author given in support of that conclusion? And that's just a summary of the argument itself. And then a critical evaluation of the argument, and that will consist in asking and answering the following two questions. First, there is the support question. And the support question roughly goes like this: if the premises were true, would that make the conclusion more likely to be true? So you're asking essentially, do the premises or would the premises support the conclusion if true? The second is the content question. Are the premises good? Now notice I didn't say are the premises true. I said are the premises good? What does it mean to be a good premise? Well, of course, we're going to talk about that in a moment. Let me mention that, let's say you ask the support question. If the premises were true, would they make the conclusion more likely to be true? And the answer to that question is no. That even if the premises were true, they would not increase the likelihood of the conclusion. Well, notice at that point, you're kind of done. There's really no point in moving on to the content question, because notice what you've said. You said, look, even if everything you said is absolutely correct, it doesn't support the conclusion you want me to accept. Right? So that's a really terrible argument. Right? So imagine that I'm running for political office. Perish the thought, but let's say I am. And I'm trying to convince you that you should vote for me. And why should you vote for me? Well, I say, well, my opponent cheated on her taxes, she was unfaithful to her husband, and she kicks dogs. Therefore, you should vote for me. Notice that's a terrible argument, because even if those premises were true, even if it's true that she cheated on her taxes, that she was unfaithful to her husband, and that she kicks dogs, that doesn't show you should vote for me. It doesn't support the conclusion at all. For all you know, I'm worse. Maybe I cheated on the taxes. I was unfaithful to my wife. I kick dogs and I kick cats, right? I might even be worse. So again, there's an example of a really bad argument, such that even if the premises were true, they would fail to support the conclusion. And if that's the case, we don't even have to get into whether the premises are true or not. We don't even have to determine whether she really did cheat on her taxes or whether she really does kick dogs. Why? Because it's irrelevant to the conclusion I'm trying to establish. So that would be an example of a really bad argument because it fails the support question. And that kind of eliminates the need of moving on to the content question because, again, it would be irrelevant. Notice something else, that I phrased the question in such a way that it deals both with inductive arguments and deductive arguments, okay? So in a well-formed deductive argument, not only would the true premises make the conclusion more likely, the true premises would assure the likelihood of the truth of the conclusion. So in a well-formed deductive argument, if the premises were true, the conclusion would have a probability of 1, would be absolutely certain. In an inductive argument, the conclusion wouldn't have a probability of 1. It wouldn't be absolutely certain. But if it's a good inductive argument, a strong inductive argument, then it should at least raise the probability of the conclusion. Okay. So again, are the premises good? That's the content question. Well, what does that mean? Well, I contend that to be a good premise, a premise has to have 3 properties. Number 1, it must be true. Naturally, if your premise is false, or even if one of your premises is false, that eliminates the strength that it could give to your conclusion. Nothing follows from false premises. Nothing follows from falsity. And so if I establish that one of your premises is false, that's I've shown that you've given an unsuccessful argument for your conclusion. But remember that the point of an argument is to persuade. And so the person offering the argument is trying to persuade her audience or his audience to believe that conclusion. So since there's practical work that's you're trying to accomplish with an argument, it's not enough that the premise be true or the premises be true. They must also be clear. That is, they have to be free from ambiguousness or free from vagueness. Now, I'll have more to say about this in a moment, but the idea is this. If your premise is vague, in other words, if it is so vague and unclear what you're saying that I don't know whether it's true or not, then maybe it is true in some sense, but you haven't communicated that to me, and I don't know whether I can believe your conclusion because I literally don't know what you're saying in your premise. The same holds for ambiguity. If your premise admits of multiple incompatible interpretations, then I don't know which one you mean, so I certainly don't know that what you're saying is true. Maybe what you mean is true, but you haven't communicated that clearly to me, and so your premise fails to convince me, right? Your argument fails to convince me. So not only must your premises be true, they also must be clear. They must be free from vagueness and ambiguity that prevents me from understanding what you're saying and understanding that what you're saying is true. And then finally, your premise set must be reasonable. By reasonable, I mean non-controversial or uncontentious or plausible. Again, remember what the point of an argument is. It's to persuade. So you can't use premises that your audience finds unreasonable or unacceptable. If they don't accept your premise set, then even if what you're saying is true, and even if it's clear, it's not going to be convincing. So remember, you have to, my former colleague from the English department, we used to work together in the dean's office years ago, but she always would remind me that the first rule of rhetoric is know your audience. Know who your audience is. And so you have to know what your audience is willing to accept already and what they're not. Arguments have to start on common ground. So I have to find, well, what is it that you believe, and use that as a way of building an argument, right? I say, well, you believe this, don't you? Yes, I do. Okay, well, if you believe this and you believe that, then, right, then I'm going to be convincing. Then I'm going to be persuasive. But if I start at beliefs we don't share, beliefs we don't have in common, maybe I'm saying things that are true, maybe I'm saying things that are clear, but I'm not going to be convincing because you take my premise set to be unreasonable or contentious. Now, true is an objective matter. Whether a sentence is true or not, or whether a proposition is true or not, isn't a matter of setting or audience or that sort of thing. Right? But clarity may depend on your audience, and what's sufficiently clear for one audience may not be sufficiently clear for another. So you might have to tailor the clarity of your premise set depending on whom you're talking to. And reasonableness is going to change from audience to audience, right? So if I'm giving an argument to, I don't know, the American Association of Baptist Ministers, and I said something like God exists, they would not find that to be a contentious claim. But if they got up and left, and then they're replaced by, I don't know, American Atheist Society, and I say God exists, well, hands would go up. I say, wait a minute, right? So again, whether a premise is reasonable or not may in fact depend on your audience, and you need to be sensitive to that. Now, we can talk about common knowledge, right? those things that the ordinary person would find reasonable. And so I think that's fair in critical thinking to kind of rely on this background beliefs of common knowledge, right? The earth is more than 5 minutes old, uh, et cetera, right? And there's not a lot of people who would genuinely doubt that. And if you're going to criticize an argument by saying, oh, this premise is unreasonable, or this premise is contentious, or this premise is implausible, that's fine, but that's the way to begin your criticism. In and of itself, that's not a criticism. That's just a claim. Right? So if you're going to say this premise is unacceptable because it's implausible or it's contentious, you have to go on to say who would find it unreasonable? What reasonable person would reject this, or at least be agnostic about it or be unwilling to accept it, and why? That some person, someplace doubted it is not sufficient. You have to show that a relatively reasonable, informed, contemporary individual would reject it or would find it problematic and explain why that would be so. So it's fair to criticize a premise as being false and provide evidence that it is. It's fair to criticize a premise by saying it's vague or ambiguous. But again, you'd have to show it is so vague and so ambiguous that we cannot determine whether it's true or not. Likewise, it's fair to criticize a premise as being unreasonable, but you must then go on to build the case as to say what reasonable objections might be offered against that premise. So here I'm saying much the same thing. Truth, again, the logical analysis that we were talking about in the previous presentations is chiefly concerned with the support question. But the task of the critical evaluation of an argument, and therefore being a critical thinker, requires more than logical analysis alone. To establish whether we should believe the conclusion of an argument, we must do more than a simple logical analysis. We need to do something more than look at support. That is, we must look at more than whether the premises would support the conclusion if they were true. We must also determine whether the premises are true or not. So that takes us out of the realm of logical analysis and may require that we do some science or some history or some law or some other kinds of investigation. Is that proposition in fact true? And again, determining whether the premises are true or not is not, strictly speaking, part of logic. But determining whether they're true or not may in fact require consulting with experts from different areas or doing some research. It also means we have to make sure the premises are clear enough so as to be investigated, right? We can make them, we can agree on how to interpret it so that we can conduct the proper investigation and we know what evidence would or would not support the truth of the premises. The second element is clarity. Remember that the point of an argument is to persuade. Therefore, it's not enough that the premises be true, they must also be understood. If the premises are vague, and specifically, if they are so vague that we cannot know whether they're true or not, the argument will be unpersuasive. This is a weakness in an argument. Similarly, remember that the point of an argument is to persuade, therefore it's not enough that the premises be true. They also must be accepted by the person at whom the argument is directed. If the claims are controversial, then it will diminish the ability of the argument to persuade. While whether a sentence is clear or reasonable will depend in large part on who is listening, truth does not. Truth would be an objective feature that doesn't change with a changing audience. Consider the following argument. The Bible is the inspired word of God. Premise 2, the Bible says God exists. Conclusion, God exists. Well, now let's do the support question and the content question. And let's start with the support question. If the premises were true, would they make the conclusion more likely to be true? Would those premises, if true, support the truth of the conclusion? Give you a moment. Well, hopefully you see yes, right? In fact, it's hard to imagine how the premise set could be true and yet the conclusion false. In other words, if the Bible really is the inspired word of God, and if the Bible does in fact say God exists, it would seem to require that God exists. Right? So I think the premises, if true, would give very strong support to the conclusion. Again, I'd be hard-pressed to imagine how the premises could be true and the conclusion false. I might even be tempted to consider that a deductively valid argument, although there's questions of how to interpret it, maybe not. But the problem with this argument, and I think this argument does have a problem, is that the first premise, whether true or not, is even more controversial than the conclusion. That is, anyone who doubts the conclusion will surely not accept the first premise. Thus, there is no way this argument could persuade anyone. Because notice what's going on here. If I accept the first premise, then I probably already accept the conclusion. And if I reject the conclusion, or at least I have doubts about the conclusion, well, then I'm certainly going to reject and have doubts about the first premise. So if I believe the conclusion, the argument is not necessary because I already believe the conclusion. If I don't believe the conclusion, the argument is useless because I don't accept the first premise. So either I'm preaching to the converted, right? You maybe heard that phrase, which is sort of a silly waste of time, or I'm using premises that my audience isn't going to accept. And again, I'm not persuading anyone. I'm not persuading the ones who already believe the conclusion, and I'm not persuading the ones who don't believe the conclusion. Remember that, generally speaking, even in a well-formed argument is only as plausible or reasonable as its least plausible premise. So you want to build your argument with as plausible a premises as possible. You might be aware of the fact that if I have inductively believed premises with some degree of probability, right, that the more probability I build into the premise set, the more improbability I build into the premise set, the more improbable the conclusion. So notice, let's say my premise one has a 75% chance of being true, but a 25% chance of being false. And premise two has a 75% chance of being true, but a 25% chance of being false. Well, then my conclusion really only has a 50% chance of being true, right? Because I have 25% chance that my first premise is false and a 25% chance that my second premise is false. So it doesn't quite work out that way, but you get the idea, right? The more possibility for error you build into your premise set, the more it detracts from the reliability of your conclusion. This is often the case for circumstantial evidence, right? In, say, jury trials, where I might be a prosecuting counsel, and I'm, there's a, where am I going with this? Let's say I have 10 pieces of evidence, right? And you say, okay, that is very, evidence piece number one does seem to indicate the guilt of the accused, but it could have been a coincidence. And then I have evidence piece number two. Well, yes, that also seems to indicate the guilt of the accused, but that could have been a coincidence too. Well, 3 could have been a coincidence, and 4 could have been a coincidence, and 5 could be. But notice then that starts to accumulate. Number 1, if that were the only piece and it had, the possibility of being a coincidence, I wouldn't find that proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But notice for the accused to be innocent, 1 would have to be a coincidence, and 2 would have to be a coincidence, and 3 would have to be a coincidence, and 4, and 5, and 6. Well, what's the likelihood that 10 such coincidences occurred? Again, that's actually building the probability of the conclusion, okay? Oops. Okay, yeah. All right, so let's take an argument, and let's take this one. Killing animals for food causes unnecessary pain and suffering. Causing unnecessary pain and suffering is wrong. Killing animals for food is wrong. Now, if I were saying that these 3 sentences represent an argument, which of the 3 would you say is the best candidate for being the conclusion? Hopefully, you would have selected killing animals for food is wrong. But if that's the case, then a more explicit way of stating the argument would be this: killing animals for food causes unnecessary pain and suffering. Causing unnecessary pain and suffering is wrong, therefore, killing animals for food is wrong. Now, if the premises were true, would they make the conclusion more likely to be true? Again, this is the support question. So it's the first question we ask when analyzing the argument. Let me back up. So here we have our argument. If those premises were true, if it were in fact true that killing animals for food causes unnecessary pain and suffering, and if it were also true that causing unnecessary pain and suffering is wrong, would those two premises jointly increase the probability of the third, that killing animals for food is wrong? Yes. In fact, the argument, I think, is deductively valid. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have the probability of 1. Notice we've seen this argument before, right? Well, we haven't seen this particular argument, but you know what we have seen is this particular argument form. Remember, formal logic. But we've seen this argument form before. Remember, we saw all A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. Well, whoops. This is the same argument, right? Except in this case, we're saying instead of all A, we're saying all killings of animals for food are causings of unnecessary pain and suffering. And all causings of unnecessary pain and suffering are cases of wrongful action. Therefore, all killings of animals for food are cases of wrongful action. So the variables are different, but the form is the same. Instead of A, B, and C, we have K, C, and W, but notice they all are literally in the same formal configuration. And this is a valid argument form. If the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Both arguments have exactly the same form. By the way, this argument form has a name. The name is Barbara. In the Middle Ages, they named all of the valid argument syllogistic categorical syllogisms, and this is Barbara. Barbara consists of 3 what they call universal affirmative claims, and universal affirmative claims were called A claims. So it's 3 A's. All A is B, all B is C, therefore all A is C, A. That's all. And so they take the 3 A's and they turn it into a name, and that was Barbara. I guess it could have been Samantha. I guess it could have been Amanda, but it's Barbara. It's a long story. They had a lot of time in the Middle Ages. No Netflix. So, content question now. Are the premises good? Meaning, are they true? Are they clear? Are they non-controversial? Well, no. Here I think we have problems, right? I don't think the premise set is good in terms of content. The content or the premises are not good, is not good. Right? So I'm going to restrict myself largely to premise 1 in this analysis. So remember, premise 1 is saying killing animals for food causes unnecessary pain and suffering. Well, first of all, they leave unspecified pain to whom? Doesn't bother me. I don't have a problem with it. Right? So who or what is caused this pain or suffering? There's a vagueness question. So before I can say, yes, it does, I have to know to whom, to what. Unnecessary, that's a trigger word, right? We're going to talk about this later on in this class as well, just this class of word, right? But unnecessary requires further stipulation. Unnecessary for what? Look, if I want beef stroganoff, some animal's got to die. And not just any animal, some bovine animal, right? So, and you go, well, look, they didn't say it's unnecessary for beef stroganoff. Fair enough, but they didn't say unnecessary for what? To say something is unnecessary requires further, right? So that should be one of those words that a little bell goes off in the back of your head that go, for what? What is unnecessary? So there's a vagueness question. So again, these two criticisms prevent me from knowing whether I can accept premise 1 or not, because there's a literal sense in which I don't know what premise 1 is saying. Also notice the quantifier, strictly speaking, the quantifier was left off. I didn't say all, I didn't say some, I didn't say all or some. I left the quantifier off entirely, right? It's like when I say doctors prefer sugarless gum, or dentists prefer, it used to be a line for Trident, right? Dentists prefer sugarless gum for their patients who chew gum. Which all dentists, most dentists, some dentists, one, two people who happen to be on the board of Trident Gum, right? You didn't say, right? Study participants said they felt that this relieved their suffering. How many? All, some, the majority, 50%, 20%? So sometimes individuals will leave off quantifiers because they want you to assume larger numbers than in fact they have evidence for. And whether they're doing it for deceptive reasons or not, if you leave out the quantifier, it becomes problematic because you aren't sure what is being alleged or what is being claimed. Notice if I said some killing of animals for food causes unnecessary pain and suffering, and some causing of unnecessary pain and suffering is wrong, nothing follows from those two claims. That's like if I said some cars are green and some cars are made in Japan. What follows from that? Nothing. Right? Nothing follows from two some claims. So since the quantifier was left off, that argument is problematic because I literally don't know what the premises are claiming. Also, they said killing of animals for food, but who's doing the killing, right? I mean, so when, I don't know, a lion kills an antelope on the plains of the Serengeti, I think that's where lions and antelope are, right? Although, no, the antelope are on our plains. I don't know. But anyway, so when a lion kills its prey, is it doing something that's morally wrong, right? Would it be right to claim that? Are they claiming that lions killing animals, or tigers, or bears for that matter? Oh my. Who's doing the killing? Right? It isn't specified in the argument. So notice the initial argument has been proven unsuccessful. That is inadequate to establishing its conclusion. And the reason for the bold is because I want to really stress that I'm a little sensitive to this as someone who teaches philosophy, where I go, oh, you philosophers, you never prove anything. False. We have now proven that that argument is unsuccessful. That argument does not establish its conclusion. That argument is gone. That argument is toast. That argument is pushing up the daisies. That argument has gone to join the choir invisible. And this in and of itself constitutes philosophical progress. We've moved on now, right? But it doesn't stop the conversation. It's not like the vegetarian goes, oh my gosh, you're right. What was I thinking? Pass me the chicken McNuggets. No. Now that we've pointed out problems with the argument, the dialogue continues. Remember, philosophy is dialectic. So while that argument is over, the conversation isn't, the conversation continues. So we are a dialectic. We're involved in a dialectical process. So remember that we talked about this before, that the dialectical process is thesis, killing animals for food is wrong, justification, causing unnecessary pain and suffering is wrong, killing animals for food causes unnecessary pain and suffering, critical review. Your premise set is too vague. You don't establish it. The clarity is sufficient to know that they're true. Therefore, your argument doesn't work. Revision, right? That's step number 4. And step number 4 is going to require that we revise the argument to address the criticisms that have been raised thus far. So in response to the vagueness objections, right, where an argument is vague, we must try to suppose what a reasonable person would have probably meant. Unless, of course, you could simply ask the arguer, right, your interlocutor. So if you and I are actually having a philosophical discussion and philosophical argument, and I make a claim that you find to be problematic and vague or ambiguous, you can just ask me, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by killing animals for food? Do you mean all? Do you mean something, right? If I'm not available, right, Or if you're reading, an argument that was done by a philosopher who died hundreds of years ago, or, some celebrity who simply won't answer your witty Twitter comment or something like that. Well, then what you may have to do is fill in the blank for that individual. This is called, this is called extending the principle of charity, right? What would a reasonable, intelligent person probably have meant? So you extend to them a charitable interpretation of their premise. So extending a charitable interpretation to a vague term, we might get something like this. They didn't specify to whom or to what, who or what is experiencing the pain, but what did they probably mean, right? Well, they probably meant, maybe you see this coming, the animals, right? They weren't claiming I experience pain when you kill animals for food, or the guy down the block experiences pain when you kill animals for food. No, they said the animals. The animals are experiencing pain when you kill them for food, and therefore, blah, 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 blah. But they probably mean the animals, right? Again, they didn't specify what they meant by unnecessary, but to say they meant unnecessary for beef stroganoff would be an uncharitable interpretation. That is probably not what a reasonable, intelligent person would have meant by that sentence. What would they probably have meant? Well, we can argue about that, but I'm going to give it this. Whoops. Whoops. No. Home. It's a new keyboard. So here's a quick review, right? They probably meant something like this: unnecessary for good health and human nutrition. In other words, it is simply not necessary to eat meat in order to have a healthy diet, in order to live a full and complete human life. Quantifier. Well, I kind of already tipped my hand on that. The only one that's going to work is all, right? They have to mean all. Some isn't going to work. And who's doing the killing? Do they mean lions on the plains of the Serengeti? No. They probably mean humans, right? When human beings kill animals for food. So let's take stock of where we are now, and we have a new argument. Now, how do I know it's a new argument? More words, right? There's more words than there were the last time. So now we have this, something like all human killing of animals for food causes pain and suffering to the animals, which is unnecessary for good health and human nutrition. All causing of pain and suffering to animals, which is unnecessary for good health and human nutrition, is wrong. Therefore, all human killing of animals for food is wrong. Notice any modifications we make to one part of the argument has to be carried through to the other. So if I'm talking about human killings of animals in the premise, I have to talk about human killings of animals in the conclusion. I have to be using the same terms throughout the argument. The argument is good on support. Remember, it has the same form. It's still Barbara, and Barbara is still valid, and Barbara is valid anytime we run into Barbara. Right? But there are other objections we might raise, objections 5 and 6, which would defeat even this new, clearer version of the argument that we have that we're looking at now. So for instance, objection 5 might be, maybe eating meat is necessary for good health and human nutrition. Maybe it is necessary to kill animals for food. And this would be true in either of two cases. There might be dietary reasons. Maybe human beings are the sort of creatures that we must consume animal protein in order to live healthy lives. And if that's true, if eating meat and the regular consumption of meat is necessary for good health and human nutrition, and the only way we're going to get that is by killing animals, well, then premise 1 is false. And if it's a false premise, the argument is defeated. Nothing follows from a false premise, and the argument fails. But in addition to dietary reasons, one might cite circumstantial reasons. There might be times and places where the only available nutritious form of sustenance is an animal. And the only way to continue to live a healthy life, to stay alive, would be to kill that animal and consume it to eat. So there might be circumstances like your plane crashes in the Andes and there's nothing around to eat except some animals, well, and maybe your fellow passengers. And so the only way you're going to be able to survive is to kill some animals, right? So there's a circumstance. Now notice the premise, as we've agreed, says all killing of animals for food causes unnecessary pain and suffering. So if there's even a few such instances where killing animals, if there's even one such instance where it is absolutely necessary to kill an animal in order to sustain good health and human nutrition, then the premise is false. And you have to reject it, and the vegetarian would then perhaps have to revise it further. The sixth objection would say, look, the claim is that we're causing pain and suffering to animals when we kill them for food, but maybe that's not true. Maybe we don't actually cause animals pain when we kill them for food. And this could also be true in either of two ways. What about painless slaughter, right? Can't we kill animals in a painless way? Don't we, in fact, already, sometimes at least, kill animals in a painless way? Say, Fluffy is getting up there in years and she has terrible arthritis and she's kind of going blind and her health is failing terribly and you don't want her to suffer. So you take Fluffy to the vet and the vet euthanizes Fluffy. And we normally think that the vet has killed Fluffy, but presumably in a painless way. And we don't find that to be morally objectionable. Well, assuming Fluffy is not your grandmother, Fluffy is your cat. But that was a tasteless joke. But if it's the case that anyone ever painlessly slaughtered an animal, then the claim that all killing of animals causes unnecessary pain and suffering would be false, because we would have at least one instance where the animal was not killed in a painful way, it was not caused any pain, right? If it was quickly executed, quickly killed, quickly slaughtered, right? I had a student one time who was not from the United States, and she came from a village where in her country where they regularly raised chickens to eat, but the chickens basically lived happy little chicken lives running around the village. They're very used to being around people. They were not frightened of human beings. And when they decided that, that's one that we're going to have for dinner later on, they would get the chicken and pick it up, and it was used to being picked up, and they would pet it and calm it. It was used to being in a human being's arms and that sort of stuff. And then they twist its head really fast and kill it. Now, that wasn't probably as reassuring as my student thought it was going to be, but it would be an example of killing an animal in a way that was presumably painless. That chicken was dead before the chicken knew what was happening, right? Well, there would be an example of perhaps painless slaughter or nearly painless slaughter. And one might even object that how do we even know that animals feel pain, right? They might boldly claim animals don't feel pain, or more modestly claim that we can't be confident that animals feel pain. Now, I think this is a particularly weak objection, but I entertain it for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons I entertain this objection is because René Descartes would have made that claim that animals don't feel pain. That may seem like a wildly unreasonable claim to you, but René Descartes did not think it was wildly unreasonable. And we're going to look at, here's the argument that René Descartes gave for this. He said something like this: in order to feel pain, an animal must, in order to feel pain, a thing must have a soul. Animals don't have souls, therefore animals don't feel pain. Is that argument valid? If the premises were true, would the conclusion be more likely to be true? Well, think about the premises again. In order to feel pain, a thing must have a soul. Animals don't have souls. Conclusion, animals don't feel pain. Yes, actually, there's nothing wrong with the logic there. It seems impeccable. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Yes, that's a deductively valid argument. Is that a good argument? I don't think so. But again, not because it fails the support question, but because it fails the content question. Are the premises clear, true, and non-controversial? I don't know. No, I do know, actually. No, I think they're problematic. What the heck is a soul? How do we know that animals don't have one? And how do we know you need one in order to feel pain? So I find the premise set to be very controversial and problematic. But the logic is fine. Okay? But he would be someone who would say 6b, animals don't feel pain. So how might the vegetarian respond to objection 5a, that eating meat is necessary for good health and human nutrition? Notice, if that were true, it would defeat her argument. Well, but notice, who should answer the question, is eating meat necessary for good health and human nutrition? Not a philosopher, right? Presumably, it should be a scientist. This is an empirical question, not a philosophical question. We should get a doctor or a physician or a dietitian or a nutritionist or a biologist or someone else, someone who does involved with the empirical studies. And we would do empirical research to determine whether the consumption of meat and animal protein is necessary for good health and human nutrition. Again, this is why philosophers need to have friends. Even when doing ethics, they need to have friends in the science departments and history, et cetera, right? Because we need to establish the truth of certain claims, sometimes empirical claims. And this is one such empirical claim. But notice, it's not like the jury is out on this, right? We happen to know, or I happen to know, that eating meat is not necessary for good health and human nutrition. And it's not because I teach philosophy, it's because I read Time magazine. That's about the extent of my scientific sophistication, I suppose. But this shouldn't surprise us that we already have a wealth of empirical evidence that eating meat is not necessary for a good healthy human life. And it shouldn't surprise us given the fact that we know there have been millennia of civilizations that have been vegetarian or largely vegetarian, and they've lived healthy human lives, and they've had culture, and they've had arts, and they've had soldiers and military and commerce, etc. And nevertheless on a strictly vegetarian or nearly entirely vegetarian lifestyle. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that eating meat is not necessary for good health and human nutrition. Again, science must decide if eating meat is necessary for good health and human nutrition or not. However, the objection fails because it has been shown it is unnecessary. But what about the claim for circumstantial reasons, right? Again, if that's true, it would defeat the vegetarian's argument. And here, I think it's a stronger objection because it does seem to be true. There have been and continues to be times and places where eating meat is the only form of human sustenance, or at least reliable human sustenance. And I don't just mean when your plane crashes in the Andes, but you figure before the age of refrigeration and long distance commerce, there were places in the world where you didn't have year-round access to reliable food. Historically, we believe that one of the reasons human beings started herding animals was so that they would have year-round access to nutritious food when the crops fail or during the winter or that sort of thing, right? So again, there have been and continue to be times and places where eating meat is a practical requirement for good health and human nutrition, again, given the circumstances. There have been and continues to be times and places where eating meat is a practical necessity. Historically, meat was necessary for good health and human nutrition when food supplies were limited or unreliable. Now, maybe it's not necessary in modern industrialized nations where we have year-round access to a wide variety of foodstuffs. Keep in mind, if you're going to be a vegetarian, you can't simply stop eating meat. You have to supplement your diet with a variety of different foods, different kinds of proteins. My younger sister, Kelly, when she was in high school, decided to be a vegetarian, but all she did was cut meat out of her diet, and she wasn't careful about what else she was eating, and she ended up getting very anemic and sick. Now, since then, she's learned to be much more circumspect in what she eats, and she looks marvelous and is doing very well and has had 2 children and very active in Taekwondo and a professional dancer, et cetera, is a very healthy, but on a vegetarian diet. But it means varying your food, varying your diet. So the vegetarian must narrow her focus to those times and places where a vegetarian lifestyle is a real practical possibility, where you have year-round access to a variety of foodstuffs. Number 6, we can and do sometimes kill animals in a painless way. Since this is true, the claim that all killing of animals for food causes pain and suffering is clearly false. If even one time someone humanely slaughtered an animal, the all is too broad a generalization. Again, the vegetarian must narrow her focus to those times and methods of slaughter which are not, in fact, painless. What about this, that animals don't feel pain, or more modestly, that we cannot be confident that animals do feel pain? Well, I think the vegetarian can dismiss this objection relatively easily. But how? Why do we think animals experience pain? If I were to ask you, say I'm like Rene Descartes or something like this, and I say, I'm not sure animals feel pain. Prove that to me. What reasons, what evidence would you point to try to convince me that animals feel pain? Well, of course, if this were an actual class, you would be answering my question. But usually what students first point to is the kinds of behaviors that animals engage in when they're experiencing pain, right? They whimper, they moan, they avoid painful situations, they cry, etc. So they exhibit what we might call pain behavior. And you say, well, yes, they must experience pain because they in fact exhibit pain behavior. But notice, I might construct a cleverly constructed machine that also experienced pain behavior. Right? I might have some sort of MP3 player that was saying, oh, please turn me off. I'm getting so hot. This is excruciating. Oh, this is awful. But that's just a recorded voice. Now, it's making sounds that if I made those sounds, you might think I was experiencing pain, but you don't think the MP3 player is experiencing pain. Or maybe Surrey is saying, please don't shut me off. I don't want to die now. You don't really think Surrey is actually expressing volition or wishes, even if there's something like the conscious behavior that she's experiencing. So animals not only have the behavior, they also have the biology to support conscious pain, unlike a tape recorder or a robot, etc. Right? So what we know about pain from our own personal experience is that, yes, it usually coincides with certain characteristic behavior, but it also coincides with a certain biology, that you need a brain and a central nervous system. So that, notice, if you stop the impulse from my hand to my brain and you interrupt it at any place along the way, you could set my hand on fire. Pain doesn't happen. It only happens when that impulse makes its way to this central processing unit, which is my brain. So if you don't have that, if you don't have the biology to support conscious pain, then the behavior does not give us hands down reason for thinking that it's got the actual conscious experience of pain. Because animals exhibit pain behavior and the biology to support conscious pain, the objection fails. It is far more reasonable to believe that animals do feel pain than to believe that they do not. This despite the fact that we can only infer their subjective states. We cannot directly verify them. So I cannot feel their pain and somehow directly know they're experiencing pain. I can only infer their pain from their behavior and their biology. In the same way that I can't directly feel your pain either. But when you say, I have a headache, I'm assuming that you're experiencing the same kind of experience that I experience when I say things like, I have a headache. And why is that? Well, because you have the same brain, the biology, and the behavior. Therefore, it is unreasonable to believe that animals do not feel pain. By the way, this is a philosophical problem called the problem of other minds. And it's explored in movies like Blade Runner or iRobot or AI. There's been much more recent movies that do the same thing. This is a favorite theme for science fiction writers to explore, right? How do I know that this thing which appears to be conscious, in fact, is conscious? My colleague, Eugene Marshall, regularly teaches a course called Metaphysics and Science Fiction, and this is one of the things that they talk about. Science fiction gives philosophers a wonderful canvas on which to explore thought experiments and metaphysical questions like the problem of other minds. Again, I know I have a mind and subjective experience, but how do I know anything else does, including you or robots, etc.? Okay, so now we have a new argument, right? How do I know it's a new argument? More words, right? All human killings of animals for food, as practiced by the commercial meat industry, so that's trying to take care of objection number 6A, in the 21st century US, so we're not talking about the Inuit people in the Arctic Circle in the 1800s, we're talking about contemporary 21st century US individuals, right? That's taking care of objection 5B, causes pain and suffering to the animals, which is unnecessary for good health and human nutrition. Causing pain and suffering to animals, which is unnecessary for good health and human nutrition, is wrong. Therefore, all human killing of animals for food, as practiced by the commercial meat industry in the 21st century US, is wrong. So notice we have the same form. So we still have Barbara. Barbara is still valid, so it still passes the support question. If the premises were true, they would indeed make the conclusion more likely to be true. And now we have premises which are far clearer, presumably reasonable, ostensibly true. And so it's a much more improved argument than where we started. So if the premises are true, then they would support the conclusion. The conclusion would have to be true. Now, you might still resist the conclusion. You might still say, no, I still think the conclusion is false, or at least I don't know whether the conclusion is true or not. But in order to do that, you would have to say which of those two premises you believe to be false and why, or at least which of these two premises you can't commit to, right? That it doesn't seem, maybe it's true, but maybe it isn't, you just don't know, right? So you'd have to show that it is reasonable to be an agnostic about one or both of those premises, or you may have to disprove one or both of those premises, but that's the only way you're going to get out of rejecting the conclusion. Well, on the pains of logic, right? So the foregoing represents philosophy in method and in content. This has been theory postulation, justification, critical review, and revision on a non-empirical, but nevertheless meaningful question. Specifically, this is an ethical conversation, dialectic, which proceeds by theory postulation, justification, critical review, and revision. Epilogue. Well, further revisions might still be needed. For instance, what about clams and shrimp? Why would clams and shrimp present a problem even for the argument that we've just finished off with? Why would that still present a problem? Well, I'll leave you guys to think about that. You can let me know what you come up with. Also, let's be clear on what this argument establishes, if anything, and what it does not establish. For instance, this argument does not establish that eating meat is wrong. You might go, oh, sure it does. No, it doesn't. The word meat doesn't appear anywhere in that argument. So there's no way that argument establishes that eating meat is wrong. Now, maybe you could go from the conclusion, killing animals so qualified is wrong, and get to eating meat is wrong, but it would take another conceptual bridge. It would take another argument. And you might say something like this: killing animals so qualified is wrong. Buying meat in the grocery store supports this wrongful practice. Supporting a wrongful practice is itself wrong. Therefore, buying meat in the grocery store is wrong, right? Pardon me. So you might be able to build a conceptual bridge from where we left off to where you want to go, but that's what would have to happen. And that bridge itself would be another argument, which requires critical review and maybe revision, etc. This is the nature of logic, critical thinking, and philosophical reasoning. Again, you could try to go from where we are, but that would take this conceptual conceptual bridge a new argument which itself be subject to critical review. So I'm not a vegetarian now. I was for a number of years, but not at the moment. But when I was a vegetarian, and if you were a vegetarian out there, maybe you've had this experience as well, it was amazing how many times meat would make its way into my meals unintentionally, right? So I remember being at a restaurant one time and I ordered a grilled cheese sandwich. I wasn't a vegan, but I was a vegetarian. Ordered a grilled cheese sandwich, and the waitress came by and said, "Oh, I put some bacon in for her." What? I put some bacon in the grilled cheese for you. Why? Why would you do that? Right? Why would you arbitrarily? Yes, bacon makes everything better, but why would you arbitrarily put bacon into a customer's grilled cheese when that's not what they asked for, right? What if I was keeping kosher or something like that, or avoiding meat for health reasons? Now, I wasn't. It wasn't a dietary religious observation. It wasn't a health reason. It was for moral reasons, kind of like what we've been discussing. But still, however, what was I going to do at that point? Say, "Oh, take it back. I don't eat flesh," and be like all, morally superior or something like that. Well, no, I liked meat. That's why I'm not a vegetarian now, right? Even then, I liked meat. That bacon, that pig was dead. Me sending it back is just going to be wasting it. That's not helping anybody. So I ate the darn thing, right? Did I do anything morally wrong? Well, even when I was sympathetic to these kinds of arguments, and frankly, I still am, no, I don't think I did. Right? Another time I remember going over a relative's house and I said, "Oh, what are you having?" And she told me they were doing pasta primavera. Oh, perfect, pasta primavera, yeah, that's great. Except her way of making pasta primavera is with pasta, mozzarella cheese, and red peppers and sausage. Not even a vera, right? There's no vera in your pasta primavera. I pointed this out. But again, I'm at dinner. Here's what they bring me to eat. What am I supposed to do? Send it back? Am I saving any animals by doing that? Sometimes discretion is the better part of valor, and in that case, I ate that as well. Right? Which is probably why I didn't have a great reputation as a vegetarian, since kind of the hard part about being a vegetarian is actually not eating meat. But you see my point, though. Eating meat is one thing. Killing animals for food is another. Even if I show that killing animals for food is wrong, that doesn't immediately translate into the claim eating meat is wrong, right? There is some slippage there. And the general idea is be careful of what an argument proves, if anything, and what it doesn't prove. Thomas Aquinas, the medieval theologian and philosopher, gave various arguments for the existence of God. One such argument was his argument from motion, where he argues that there must be an unmoved mover. And he gives these various premises, blah, 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 blah. Conclusion, therefore, there is an unmoved mover, after which he says, and that all men call God. And you go, St. Thomas, wait a minute there. Even if you establish your conclusion that's an unmoved mover, have you in fact established that that thing, unmoved mover, is God? Right? Maybe you haven't done that. Maybe that's a conceptual bridge that you need to go over. Now, frankly, that's not quite a fair criticism of Thomas Aquinas, because when he says that, and that all men call God, he may have simply been making a historical claim. It so happens that everyone who's talked about an unmoved mover prior to me has identified that unmoved mover with God, right? So, and that all men have called God, which literally was true, right? Aristotle introduces the unmoved, actually Plato introduces the idea of an unmoved mover, right? And they identify it with deity. But the point, though, remains, be careful for what an argument establishes, if anything, and what it doesn't establish. All right, so that concludes my remarks on this argument analysis. I hope you found it useful. And until next time, see you then. Why can I? There we go.